3, 2, 1. I'm about ready to get started talking about what we watched last week. I'm Casey, and I just want to start off by acknowledging that we are going to be making, lots of critiques and reflecting on what we watched, but that doesn't mean anything is intended to be any sort of in-depth criticism or review on anything we're discussing. This is just a series intended to spread a little love for the things we love. The fiction, the non-fiction, the movies, the series, the YouTube, the theater, whatever we really figure is relevant. So let's get into what we watched the first week of June, shall we? 2024's The First Omen. Finally caught up on this one. And are we gearing up for a new Omen trilogy, or did the studio just randomly decide to shoot a prequel because, horror is booming right now? Because here, our protag is grown up, surrounded by the church, and in her final years of nunning it up, she is introduced to a few red herrings while uncovering a secret sect of the church that is heaven bent on birthing the son of the devil. The First Omen does have a lot to say on personal choice, and there being portions of and people in the church that aren't entirely corrupt, and at the same time telling a story of a girl trying to find her place in a hostile world who's being groomed by creepy old men. I have never been partial to the Christian pantheon when it comes to horror, despite Christian fantasy being a major subgenre of horror in and of itself, so this movie is immediately not for me on just about every account, but I still very much appreciated some of the undertones when explaining the multiple sects of the church, and pregnancy horror is always going to get a reaction out of me, so, movie did its job. 1988's Night of the Demons, where someone decided it would be a great idea to have a seance at the place where they burned bodies and thought it, wouldn't get you demons. And it got demons, leaving a group of teenagers of varying intelligence and moralities to escape the ever-changing hellscape of their own making. As everything unfolds throughout the story, it does begin to feel almost like a remake of Bava's Demons, at least in the basic premise and tone, in spite of it being an American production. The young actors also do a lot to make every character feel their own and very different, even if a performance or two is a little shaky. The makeup effects here too are mostly hits, with a few odd misses every now and then that never really turned my enjoyment. Special call out to the apple pie extinguishing of life that happens later in the movie. There are by far worse made and less fun Judeo-Christian based horror movies out there. Kevin Teeney's Night of the Demons doesn't shy away from what it is and pulls off plenty of original ideas to make it more than worth its 90-minute runtime. Doctor Who and the Romans. After a pretty tense literal cliffhanger that ended last serial, we just kinda start the story in the ancient Roman Empire without any explanation. Off camera, our crew casually left the TARDIS at the bottom of a canyon and have been squatting in some rando's house who's been out of town. And after a month of leisure, the Doctor decides to just kind of travel to Rome with Vicky, while Ian and Barbara are kidnapped and sold into slavery. The story's A and B plots do happen entirely separate from each other, even though everyone does end up in Rome, oddly enough. In the end, the Doctor and Vicky never learn their friends were sold into slavery. They just steal someone's identity and pretend to play the flute for Emperor Nero, while Ian has his own little Ben-Hurian odyssey, while Barbara schemes and avoids her new owner, the Emperor Nero. While Ian's is a little more standalone, but he is really put through the ringer. The Romans juggles a lot of plot beats that make the story move a little quicker than perhaps any other Doctor Who story we've seen thus far. This is easily made for my favorite historical-based episode thus far. 2023's Totally Killer. Wouldn't it be great if when your mother was just murdered, your friend finished her time machine so you could kill the killer before he makes the first killing in the first place decades ago? Well, that's the plot our protagonist is in. Trying to protect a young version of her mom and her friends from a legally distinct Max Headroom who does like to do a stab. I don't know why I sat on this for as long as I did. I think a lot of it has to do with the poster that didn't really sell me while scrolling through the streaming platforms, and that's wrong on my part because this movie was an absolute banger. Channeling 1980s time travel stories, mixing that with the energy of the self-aware slashers of the modern times to concoct a unique but familiar sci-fi horror comedy adventure. 2008's Iron Man. Iron Man still has a lot of metaphorical lifting to do. It is a pretty sure bet that if Iron Man had flopped, both motion pictures and comic books would be entirely different industries today. It starts with a twat waffle of a human being that is our protagonist having a personal awakening, and I am confident the largest portion of his fanbase does not understand that whatsoever. After his own bomb literally blows up in his face and he learns that warmongering is bad, so he makes a $1 billion suit of armor to blow up the people who blew him up. Luckily, for the sake of our sympathy, They were doing really bad stuff at the time. Then has to deal with the fallout of changing the direction of a multi-billion-dollar company. Iron Man follows all the superhero tropes you might expect, with the exception that our character's major arc is learning to be a better person and learning how to undo the wrongs that he and his family has done in the past, while looking absolutely cool and quipping every step of the way, thanks to one of the best cast leads during the turn of the century. You might see nearly every one of Iron Man's story beats coming from a mile away, but they're all executed pretty much exactly as intended and work really well. Jaws, 1975. A big town cop has decided to move to a small island town just in time for a really big shark to kill and terrorize the townsfolk, leading to a second and third act that take entirely on the water, on the hunt, leaving our three leads to bicker and survive the shark while otherwise stranded in the ocean. Jaws is considered a legendary film for a reason. It is expertly paced from beginning to end with performances that are powerful and feel real. Every frame of this movie feels like it's perfectly crafted, despite the menagerie of famous production problems behind the scenes creating the movie. Each scene linked together with a score that makes the movie both terrifying in its mystery and exciting in its chases. But there are some things with Jaws that never sat right with me, points the story's original creator, Peter Benchley, also had a problem with, as he would go on to heavily promote shark conservation. But I also don't think any of these points should take away from the technical achievement how perfectly crafted this movie is everywhere else. Before it's taken down from wherever it's streaming as a tax write-off, please go out and see Jaws. 2018's The Nightingale. No real joking around with 2018's The Nightingale. On the surface, it's a very straightforward Aryan revenge story, so all the trigger warnings that come with assault and the death of children apply. Set during the early 1800s when England was colonizing and warring with what was now Tasmania, we follow a woman indentured to a colonial officer and her revenge after her family is murdered, and a particularly uncomfortable scene. Where the movie subverts expectations comes from our lead's hostage-turned-ally, an aboriginal Tasmanian who has his own conflicts and can more than relate with the slavery and abuse that our lead has endured, culminating in far less catharsis than is typical in revenge stories, but far more moving and meditative in return. Personally, could have done with at least 2 less scenes of explicit assault. Any 2 of the many we have, but we still would have had more than enough to prove how much of an absolute bastard our villain is. At 2.25 hours, it also feels a lot longer than it needs to be, but a lot of that presents itself in flavor in this picture, as it spends a lot of time allowing its characters and the audience to meditate on what's happening. Altogether, Nightingale is a wholly unflinching and unsettling story of revenge and abuse that refuses to romanticize the atrocities that people are capable of committing. That makes for one of the most effective experiences I can recall in a while. What writer and director Jennifer Kent knows how to make a movie. 2020's Bloodshot. After our protagonist is killed in the line of duty, his body is resurrected thanks to nanobots. Now we have a super soldier with a rewritable mind that learns capitalism is taking advantage of him, that has to fight with other super soldiers, as well as be part of a whole lot of defenestrations to get to the top of the nondescript biggest building so we can do a murder. A story that wears its many twists on its proverbial sleeve kind of forgets how important reveals are, rushing past all but one to get to increasingly more bombastic action sequences that are both choreographed and animated admirably, but are consistently washed out by this corporate sterile backdrop of the movie. Again, there were a few moments that were really effective in providing good character work and depth, but they come far too little too late in this low sci-fi action mystery. I do hope there is an audience who generally loves that this exists, because I can see how much the people behind it wanted this to work. It just doesn't work for me. The Last Seed. 2024. Hostile alien world, robots fighting beyond their limits, a little bit of ecological undertones thrown in. This is a 5-minute short straight out of my pulp sci-fi dreams, carried by a plot that can be told entirely without dialogue. It's just a robot saving a little forest dude from shadow dogs. but not so simple there's not a whole lot to read into if world building is your jam. If one needs a comparison, the easiest I could make is the epic animated series Scavenger's Reign by way of animation technique, mixed with a story not dissimilar from WALL-E and the more exaggerated art style that comes with that. Really, at 5 minutes, I cannot recommend this enough. It does everything it can in a short time while still injecting as much characterization into non-human characters as possible. If you have time to spare, it will also support a number of students and is available on the YouTubes via the link in the description. 1978's Jaws 2. Our lead protagonist from Jaws returns to lead Jaws 2, where the characters have grown in the years since the initial Jaws attack, except our protag is twice as anxious about sharks and everyone in town is twice as over it, because a serial-killing great white shark can happen twice, right? Well, after a serial-killing great white shark shows up again, and nobody believes him, Brody sets out to find his sons who had gone on a little joyride in their hot-rodded-up sailboats. Instead of choosing to do something different with its plot, the sequel decided to focus on how the characters have changed in the years since the shark attacks of 1975, especially Mr. and Mrs. Brody. Our lead is even more jumpy than before, and with the self-confidence of being right, it leads to moments of real concern for his mental well-being. The Meyer character has also grown really as well, defending Brody in an ultimately deleted scene and appearing far more solemn throughout, although it could be actor Murray Hamilton's behind-the-scenes tragedy fueling this. In contrast, the Brody boys, one of which stared a dude as he was being eaten alive in the last movie, are just there to give their dad some motivation and not send someone else to fight the big bad boy. The son's eclectic group of friends range from fun to annoying and primarily act as shark chum, even if fewer get got than you might expect. Jaws 2 Electric Boogaloo, to its credit, looks, sounds, and feels like its predecessor, doing its best to capture the magic of Steven Spielberg's original. And to a degree, it succeeds, at least more so than any other shark movie that has come since. Even if the shark shows its Kermit side in this one shot. 300, from retelling the story of 300 Spartan soldiers, taking the credit of a few thousand Greek soldiers defending their land from an army of horrendous, malformed, disfigured, and diseased monsters that we call the Persians in this movie. The 300 Spartans we follow defy their city council to give their lives with the Spartan king Leonidas in an A-plot, while the Spartan queen Gorgo roots out spies in an illicit, sexy B-plot. Watching this nearly 20 years after its original release, it is remarkable how Zack Snyder managed to create a movie that is so insanely homophobic and homoerotic at the same time. Having the Spartans make gay jokes while running off half-naked to team up with guys in leather harnesses will never not be funny. But let us never forget that ancient Sparta actually encouraged the systematic abuse of children between Spartan soldiers and the boys they trained. Divorcing itself from history, though, 300 is taking full advantage of the medium to deliver one of the most exciting and hyper-energetic action epics ever put to screen. The dialogue is delivered with a poetic reverence, and the soundtrack is made to be ethereal and foreboding throughout. Every sequence is framed with specific intent, filtered through Zack Snyder's sepia-tinted eyes, to give us some beautifully choreographed dances of violence. Dragon Ball. The mystical adventure. In an alternate Dragon Ball timeline, the Emperor's advisor is collecting MacGuffins for his own machination, terrorizing villages just as an annual tournament is starting. This is where Goku comes into the story. Kind of. Not really. He's just introduced. Because more importantly, the last MacGuffin is in the hands of the best dad reminiscent of indigenous Americans in an entirely fictional world. But best dad bumps into Goku just as he's about to get caught by the Emperor's crew, when everyone decides they'd rather fight in that tournament instead. A whole lot is crammed into this 45 minutes, managing to shove in a lot of both tournament arcs and the entire Red Ribbon Army, minus the fortune teller Baba shenanigans, into this short of a runtime is not easy. Recasting several characters to be in charge of the Red Ribbon Army stand-in works magnificently and makes for some more complex character dynamics that you don't get in the original story, especially for Chaozu and Tien. Reorganizing the entire story into under an hour also lets us have some interesting fights and character interactions that we haven't seen anywhere else. out of the original 3 Dragon Ball anime features, this has, by far, the most crisp animation. Set on some very original, yet still very Dragon Ball in style set designs. For this we watched the original Japanese dub, but I know if you watch the English dub, a lot of the classic Dragon Ball voice cast does return, with the exception of a new Goku that took me a second to warm up to. Dragon Ball The Mystical Adventure might cram so much in that it might not be as good of a jumping on point to Dragon Ball as the previous 2 movies, but easily has the most to offer to anyone who likes their classic Dragon Ball and wants to see something different. Doctor Who, The Web Planet. This time around, the TARDIS crew is kind of minding their own business when the police box is pulled down to the planet Vortis, a planet in the midst of a war between a bunch of Mothmen and whining giant ants. As you might expect, the crew ends up separated from one another, some captured by the ants, hereafter referred to as the Zarbi, and others the Mothmen, likewise are named the Menoptera. While the crew does their many escape attempts, we learn that a great intelligence, not that great intelligence, has been controlling one of the factions and forced the other off the planet years ago, so, now we have to help one side win a war, I guess. When the original producers of Doctor Who demanded there be no bug-eyed monsters in the series, I am confident that this is what he was worried about. While everyone in the TARDIS crew is on point throughout and given something to do, they are stuck in an otherwise generic and low-budget sci-fi war story playing pranks on people in bug costumes. Since Susan's leaving, though, Barbara has continued to be a real boss, which is what I was hoping for. The Doctor and Vicky, meanwhile, spend most of the episode talking into the ether, waving tuning forks at ant costumes. And maybe I missed something deeper in Web Planet, but this has not been my favorite First Doctor story thus far, which is sad coming off of the romance. Finally, we come to Saloum from 2021. Saloum centers around a small group of mercenaries who are kidnapping a drug lord out of a Senegal in the midst of a political crisis when they are forced to lay low in a little resort after their getaway breaks down. It sucks that there's a cop staying at the resort as well. Oh, and the resort is the last barrier holding back an unrelenting curse. Because the movie is so ingrained in West African culture, a little bit went over my head regarding the vague mysticism that the characters we follow find themselves in, and even with that, and the language barrier, the performances of the actors and the story itself made it very clear that even if I didn't understand what was going on, that I understood the emotions that were being driven home. The 3 leads as well are particularly phenomenal at moving as a unit when the script gives them more action-y set pieces to play with. Saloum also just explores a lot. On the surface, you have an exciting action horror with its own bit of mysteries thrown in. It also wants to tackle the themes of abuse of children and the warlord system that perpetuates the region, as well as this bond of brotherhood between soldiers and friends. It makes for a very original and meditative action horror thriller that is less scary and terrifying as it is exciting and intense. Yeah, thank you for sitting with me and talking about what we watched last week. Y'all are kind and patient, and y'all are the best. Again, no crazy updates here for next week, just gonna keep on keeping on with school, movies, and work. I know I released a big Disney thing on Friday. If you can check that out, that'd be great. I know we also started The Acolyte this week, and I'm very excited to see where that story goes going forward. Again, if I mentioned anything I watched here on YouTube or any YouTube channels, they will be linked in the description, and that's all I got. So, I don't know, go out and do something good today, while looking absolutely cool and quipping every Borb. The last seed. Indiana.